The Trump administration proposes a 28-point framework drafted with Russia to end the war with Ukraine. The plan demands some painful concessions from Kyiv, surrendering the Donbas region and slashing its military. So is Washington negotiating away Ukraine's future while favouring Russia just to promise a lasting peace? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. Behind closed doors in Washington, a controversial peace plan is taking shape. The Trump administration has been consulting with Russia on a 28-point framework to end the 3.5-year war in Ukraine. The draft plan's divided into 3 sections, focusing on peace in Ukraine, a NATO-style security guarantee, and future relations between the US and Russia. But there's a problem. Ukraine had very little involvement, if any, in shaping the proposal and was informed without being asked for input. It reportedly requires Ukraine to cede the Donbas region to Russia, cut its armed forces in half, and ban foreign troops from Ukrainian soil. Is this a pragmatic path to end the bloodshed or a dangerous capitulation that rewards Russian aggression? Can peace be achieved without Ukraine at the negotiating table? And what does this mean for European security and America's global credibility? We'll put those questions to our guests in just a moment's time. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
I'm very happy. I'm good.
US President Donald Trump has issued a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. Delivered to the Ukrainian president in Kyiv by 4 of the US military's top personnel for him to discuss with Trump.
Best regards to President Trump, please, from me.
The agreement includes Ukraine ceding control of Donbas to Russia to be kept as a demilitarized zone, while parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia would be divided along the existing line of contact. Ukraine would give up some weaponry, limit troops to 600,000 personnel, and never join NATO. It also states no foreign troops would be positioned in Ukraine. In exchange, Ukraine would receive a guarantee of security from the US. The US would also assist Ukraine with rebuilding, using $100 billion of frozen Russian funds, and work with Ukraine on extracting its rare earth minerals, while Russia will be welcomed back into the global economy with the lifting of sanctions, and also have a deal with the US on the extraction of its rare earths. But Ukraine and the EU reject key points.
While Ukraine stands ready to engage in meaningful negotiations to end this war, including at the leaders' level, our red lines are clear and unwavering. There will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as Russian. Our land is not for sale.
The European stance remains the same, with the bloc saying it will support Ukraine.
The pressure must be on the aggressor, not on the victim. Rewarding aggression will only invite more of it. The EU has a very clear 2-point plan. First, weaken Russia. Second, support Ukraine.
Russia says Kyiv has stopped responding to calls for dialogue, and there is no genuine desire for peace.
As for the hypocritical appeals for peace from our former European partners, neither Zelenskyy nor his handlers seek peace, and escalation serves their interests.
President Volodymyr Zelenskyy now finds himself in a tough position. He's under pressure over a corruption scandal at home involving the energy sector. And the US is Ukraine's biggest backer, meaning the war effort would struggle without it. But he's insisting no territory can be ceded to Russia without the support of the Ukrainian people, preparing the ground for potentially tough debate over Trump's proposed terms for ending the war. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in all of our guests from Moscow. Alexander Bratersky is a political analyst and an independent journalist. From London, Samir Puri, Chatham House's director for the Global Governance and Security Centre and author of Russia's Road to War with Ukraine. From Washington, D.C. is Donald Jensen. He is a former US diplomat in Moscow and former US staffer on US-Soviet arms control negotiations. A very warm welcome to all 3 of you. Welcome to Inside Story. Alexander, could I start with you? I mean, how does the essence of this US plan differ to the maximalist ambitions of Vladimir Putin put forward previously, namely that Ukraine must give up territory in the Donbas, some of which Russia hasn't seized as yet, and that it must dramatically reduce its armed forces. Alexander.
Well, of course, if you look at the plan directly, I don't want to call it a plan. It's more like talking points, right? It's more like a plan which might be discussed in some of the places, some of the stuff might be omitted. But let's say in Istanbul, Russia demanded that the Ukrainian army can be much more, will be in a lesser extent, but now it's 600,000 people. So it's actually bigger than Istanbul proposal. And with that, actually, Ukraine had more demands on that. So actually this, some of the parts can be good for Ukraine. Even, 600,000 troops is still a stronger force.
Donald, ceding territory, slashing the army. We've heard all of this before, haven't we? And it's led precisely nowhere, Donald.
It is. Well, first of all, I think we ought to give the Trump administration credit for not giving up on the peace process, such as it is. But the whole 28-point plan, as we've seen it, is woefully inadequate. It tilts seriously to the Russian point of view. In fact, some issues are framed within the context of Russian propaganda, and it asks the Ukrainians essentially to trust a country next door which has invaded it, committed war crimes, and somehow is going to obey the rules of an international agreement. And we all know that Russia constantly violates international agreements. So I don't see this going anywhere with substantial revision, but even the Trump White House is saying we're going to talk about the plan because it's certainly unfair, unwise as it is. So a lot of changes have to be made.
Samir, why did this sudden U-turn from the Americans come about, do you think? I mean, not long ago, Trump was suggesting that Ukraine could even potentially get back all of its territory. We know that there was this failure in talks in Alaska between Putin and Trump. And then last month, there was this tense phone call between Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which led to the cancellation of a planned summit in Budapest and US sanctions on Russian oil. So how does, Samir, the US go from applying pressure on Russia to make concessions on Ukraine to this plan that seems to tilt in favour of Moscow?
Well, it's been a very eventful few months since Trump came back to office with regards to his aspiration to bring a hasty end to this war. I do think, though, that the point of putting pressure on Russia, which the Trump administration, to be fair, has done a little bit more of that in terms of secondary sanctions regarding India and other issues like that. The point of it was to still draft an agreement that could be foisted upon Ukraine. And I do think what hasn't changed, the consistency in the Trump administration's approach across 2025, has been to tilt any text in a putative agreement in favor of a face-saving exit for Russia from this invasion. I'm actually quite astonished the extent to which this 28-point plan either explicitly or implicitly acknowledges stated war aims that the Putin government has been pushing for the full nearly 4 years of this invasion. It's really all about, I think, the pressure on Zelenskyy now. From this plan to take it, that the Americans are saying you have to take it, on the corruption scandal and also on the battlefield. It's really, I think, not so much the content of the plan, but whether that accumulated amount of pressure on the Zelenskyy government actually starts to force some cracks to appear.
Alexander, the Kremlin denies having a major hand in this. However, Russia was quick to send, we know, a special envoy, one Kirill Dmitriev, to Miami to speak to his opposite number, US envoy Steve Witkoff, and smooth things over. Is this as much a Moscow plan as it is a Trump plan?
It's very interesting what you mentioned, Dmitriev, like Russia in a way cited Lavrov, and whatever we think about Lavrov, he's a seasoned diplomat and spent years in foreign policy, and Dmitriev is a new guy, he's more a businessman like a Vitkov. So Russia is now trying a different hand, let's say more like commercial, more pro-business hand, and showing the US we're actually willing to talk. Yes, this plan is actually working for the Russian side, but in the same time, the plan, as a colleague has said, can be amended in certain ways, right? To satisfy, well, cynically say, satisfying both sides, the US, Russia, and even some parts Ukraine, in some parts Ukraine.
Donald, even if this 28-point plan is a non-starter, and we've heard from the Ukrainians saying that our land is not for sale and that there are too many red lines here, do recent encounters, Donald, between Zelenskyy and Trump when he was berated in the White House suggest that he may have to simply engage in this process to avoid angering Donald Trump?
Oh, I think that's a major consideration. I can imagine how much the Zelenskyy team is against this plan privately, but they realize that President Trump and the U.S. is a key element in the peace settlement. I don't think they want this. In fact, I'm sure of it. As for your point, our previous partner made here on the broadcast, I think it's highly unrealistic to expect Ukraine to turn over land to the Russians, which the Russians have not been able to capture for the last 2 years. This is an old Russian negotiating trick. If you go a decade ago and you look at the Minsk negotiations, Russia did the same thing. They demand stuffed land doesn't even belong to them, nor do they occupy. So this is, in many ways, this plan is a repackaging of more or less traditional Russian negotiating tactics. And I think it's not going to work because the Ukrainians, above all, value their land. They're dying to protect it, and they have no intention of letting Russia have the remainder of the Donetsk that they have not been able so far to capture. If I could add another point about the negotiations, what you see consistently, and you see with the representation of Dmitriev on the Russian negotiating team, is that Putin understands that or thinks that the U.S. will respond to commercial incentives, exploring the Arctic, sharing resources in another way, and overall being better able to conduct a productive bilateral relationship. They see that as an incentive to make Trump agree to this deal. And this deal is very flawed on its face, but they hope that the U.S. will see these other incentives that Russia is dangling before them and get to the Moscow point of view. I don't think at the end of the day it's going to happen, but you can see with the Russian change of emphasis to Dmitriev over Lavrov, you can see many other signs that's Russia's strategy to get what they want, which is to dominate Ukraine. And certainly this plan would ensure that.
All right. Samir, let me put that to you then. Donald suggested that a different tactic is being taken here, that the Russians are taking very much a kind of business approach rather than the traditional diplomatic avenue. I mean, let's talk, Samir, about the business interest that jumped out of the pages of this plan, to me at least. $100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. The US, this is the interesting bit, will receive 50% of the profits from this venture, and talk of a US economic agreement to develop rare earth extraction, data centres, AI. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Samir, is this a peace plan or a business plan?
Well, there's clearly got to be commercial incentives for the US for the Trump administration to be able to sell this to the MAGA crowd at home as some sort of success. So it's obviously a continuation of the saga of the minerals deal that started much earlier this year. It is still ultimately a plan to pause the fighting along the current front lines and to engage in some kind of, well, it's not really a land swap, it's more a land concession from the Ukrainian side. To me, it's not a business plan. There is still a heavy ideological imprint in terms of Russia's war aims, which was to obviously preclude the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, to have an influence over the wider European security architecture, and to quote unquote the Donald Trump sort of the point that was made previously, to basically liberate the Donbas is what Putin said, and Trump, I think, is fairly agnostic with regards to the future of the Donbas. So I still feel that there is an enormous amount of ideology and sort of imperial ideology that's being implicitly recognized in this plan.
Well, on that point, Alexander, let me turn to you, because the plan prevents Ukraine from joining NATO, Alexander, but talks of Ukraine's accelerated membership of the EU are included. Presumably, I mean, that means European forces can provide Ukraine with weaponry, and of course, in the event of perhaps the creation of an EU or European army further down the line, it might mean EU forces and weaponry stationed in Ukraine. I mean, would Russia be willing to allow a NATO-style or NATO-adjacent-like security architecture to be present in Ukraine? Is that the suggestion here?
It's very difficult to predict right now, but Ukraine might actually have some kind of security guarantees, just like Israel has with the U.S., or can be a sort of a partner, with no NATO partner of U.S., like Georgia, for example. And, we should also say that Ukraine has a very strong military, the military which resisted the very big military machine of Russia, and Ukrainian forces are well trained and already have a lot of equipment. So those people can even teach NATO officers how to fight. So I think this is also the question of Ukrainians to manage their defense themselves with, let's say, help of some Westerners or whatever that can happen. I mean, Russia can at least, I think, close their eyes for that if other demands are met.
So there are some things that Russia would be prepared to potentially close its eyes to. Donald, something the EU is not prepared to do is let all of this happen without being actively consulted. The EU's made it clear that this can't happen without essentially Ukraine and the Europeans on board from the outset. I mean, after all, Donald, it's Europe that's talking about this coalition of the willing, isn't it? A European military force potentially on the ground in the event of a ceasefire. And Europe is also currently Ukraine's biggest military backer. I mean, how carefully does Europe need to tread here when it comes to keeping Donald Trump on side with the right level of pushback if necessary, Donald?
Well, I think they're a critical player because, as we've seen, two of the major developments this year has been, one, Ukraine's abilities to produce much more of its weaponry, and two, the Europeans at last, the EU in particular, showing a willingness to step up to the plate. And I think that's very, very critical for getting a peace down the road whenever that it may occur. It's obvious in the background of the plan that itself shows that the Trump administration really did not consult, let's say, with the Europeans at all. I think that reflects an administration priority that the Europeans are down the list of priorities from what the Europeans may want to be, and that's a very critical part of this equation. Several months ago, as you recall, we talked about a European reassurance force. We still need, and the plan this week leaves open the question of just how we are going to have these demilitarized zones, how Russia is going to take over land, without how that will, if at all, coexist with the diminished Ukrainian military force. This is all very vague. This is all stuff that needs to be sorted out and explained in much more detail. Above all, I would say, what is an American security guarantee to Ukraine mean? 30 years or so after the Budapest Accords showed that these kinds of decrees without more teeth don't mean much at all. And Ukraine is very justified in asking these questions because a lot of the provisions of the text yesterday have been just vague expressions of intent, sometimes contradictory, one element to another, and we need a lot more to see if this is going to go anywhere.
Samir, let me turn to you because the vagueness of it could be hugely problematic, couldn't it? I mean, European security is also at stake here. I note in point 3 of the plan, it says, it is expected that Russia will not invade neighbouring countries and NATO will not expand further. I mean, how confident, Samir, is a phrase like, it is expected? I mean, these sound like pretty loose guidelines that aren't going to go down very well, particularly in the capitals of the Baltic states.
Well spotted. Now, of course, one of the benefits of ambiguity is it allows diplomats to be very creative in their conversations and their interpretations. I think, as the other guests have pointed out, there is room to work with these wordings if the Ukrainians, with European assurances, want to actually engage in some kind of discussion about how to interpret these terms. It is also totally foreseeable if the negotiations do actually develop on the basis of this 28-point plan. There could be further iterations that provide specificity and that include the reactions of the different parties to each other as this process moves on. If the process moves on, if it doesn't fall apart under the weight of its own contradictions, and I think one of those big contradictions is one of the ones you've highlighted there. Just one other quick point on your previous question about the Europeans. Absolutely critical. Sure, they've been sidelined from negotiation and the drafting of this plan, but they are the ultimate advocates for Ukraine's interests. They are the ones, and the British and the French, and certainly the British, that will be most front-footed in promising security guarantees that don't necessarily have to wait for the American ones. Now, of course, British and French security guarantees have nothing of the weight that's comparable to an American security guarantee, but it's better than nothing. And it's also something that the Kyiv government believes it will be able to count on in perpetuity in the future, as opposed to the vagaries of Washington, D.C. politics.
Alexander, you've suggested that there are some things that Moscow might be prepared to turn a blind eye to in order to get something meaningful over the line. I mean, if there is going to be pushback from Ukraine and Europe, is there anything further that Putin might be willing to back down on? Any obvious things, either militarily or territorially?
Well, see, I mean, you know, as even Ukrainians and Russians, Ukrainians and everybody are not Russians, of course, are saying that their territories would not be recognized legally. You know, when I was a child, with my parents, I traveled to the Baltic states for vacation, which were part of the Soviet Union. And when I became a seasoned journalist, I understood that those countries, republics, were incorporated in the Soviet Union illegally, and they were not recognized by the Americans or the Europeans. But officially, they were part of the Soviet Union. So this can be with the same with the Donbas region. It would not be legally recognized because I understand Europeans also have their territorial problems. So let's say, of course, Russia would never be able to have those territories legally, incorporated and even then they on a constitution. So I think this is a very difficult question,
Staying with you, Alexander, because I think it's fair to say there are also some encouraging points in the plan as well, namely that the United States and Russia will agree to extend the validity of treaties on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the START 1 treaty. All civilians and civilian hostages and prisoners will be returned. Although it's hard to imagine right now, there are some areas of commercial cooperation mentioned, education programs to promote tolerance. Is this wishful thinking, Alexander?
I don't think so. Even the Russian language, for example, take the Russian language. The Russian language, which will be present of Ukraine, it's not the Russian language of Russia. It's like a French language in some other country. Those people who fought for Ukraine and spoke Russian also want to continue to speak Russian. It's nothing to do with Russia as a state. Excuse me.
Samir, nevertheless, despite the optimism in some of the points in the plan, no mention of justice for the tens of thousands of children Ukrainian officials say have been kidnapped and taken into custody by Russia. No mention of a potential post-war tribunal to deal with allegations of war crimes and mass killings allegedly carried out by Russia in the early days of the war, indeed alleged Ukrainian crimes. I mean, how ready do you think are Ukrainians for a plan like this? And would any decision need to be voted on in Ukraine in a referendum, for instance?
Well, I certainly can't speak on behalf of people in Ukraine. The one thing I think is clear, though, is there is enormous exhaustion with the fighting. And if you just take the Eastern Territories, that fighting is now since 2014. It's an enormously long time. Some of the territories still being fought over, like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, they've been on the front line since 2014. So issues of post-war justice, tribunals and such like, I suppose there's nothing necessarily preventing Ukrainians trying to pursue some of these claims in courts, but I don't think it would take place as part of this agreement. And there's an astonishing sort of sense when you read through the 28 points of sort of, well, just live and let live, which will be much simpler for the Putin regime if they can feel they have a face-saving way of saying, well, listen, we achieved some of the goals of our special military operation, X, Y, and Z. But Ukraine is a war-ravaged, and clearly it will be a traumatized nation because the suffering that has been meted out to Ukrainians, not only to service personnel and civilians directly affected by the fighting and the firing of long-range munitions, but also the society as a whole. You won't go very far in society without finding someone who has lost a loved one or someone that they know or has been somehow scarred psychologically by this. There is, I think, everything is heaped on the sort of the funds that the Europeans and others will actually provide. That's part of the plan. But of course, there are no details as to how to rehabilitate Ukraine's population after this horrific nearly 4 years.
And Donald, turn to you. What about this plan to rehabilitate Russia on the global stage? Point 13C, Russia will be invited to rejoin the G8. I mean, it was kicked out of the group's most advanced economies precisely over the invasion of Crimea. Of course, Russia might decide it doesn't want to be part of the G8, but any country with territorial ambitions looking at this is going to think, well, look, if we hold fire long enough, the world will simply move on and welcome you back.
Yes, well, I think you're absolutely correct. Putin in some ways has moved on to attacking the entire international system and trying to undermine European security. And there's no reason at all to think what is promised on the paper, on the document this week, will take place. I think once Russia gets the military position it wants of dominance over Ukraine, a lot of these other provisions in the text will be disregarded very quickly or just pro forma talked about for many, many months or years, because Russia will have what it wants. I find the chances of Russia returning kidnapped children who have been, quote, reculturated in a quasi-Nazi way, it's almost unbelievable to think this would be able to happen without Russia being forced to do so. They certainly wouldn't do so with an agreement that largely on its face favors the Russian position. If I might add one more point, which we haven't got to today, which is that the entire document is framed implicitly by an acceptance of Russia's military prowess, by an acceptance of Russia's dominance on the battlefield, by an acceptance of the Russian propaganda line that somehow Putin's win will be inevitable. And that's simply not the case. Russia's economy has trouble. The system is strained.
Donald,
and it lost a lot of people. So,
Donald, let me interrupt because I did see, Alexander, you raised some eyebrows there at that point. Alexander, what are your thoughts as we reach the end of the show?
No, yes, I would agree with Donald. I mean, the children issue is very important, but I think there would be a possibility for some organizations within Russia and Ukraine, and I know some of them work very hard, even during the war, and they were talking and they were exchanging some of the children, some of the prisoners. So those kind of organizations can work even in Russia to, let's say, with the blessing of officials who will say, let's do this because of that, some other stuff, because they're very cynical. Let's give those children back to Ukraine and get something else for that. Something might get work out with this, unfortunately. Right. But the most important thing, yes, the war, when the war is finished, all the political things can be discussed. Now the war is still ongoing.
Understood. Final word to Samir. We've got about 30 seconds left. Samir, does this look like the makings of a path to peace or a road to Ukraine's capitulation? Your final thoughts?
If this is the end game, Ukraine will leave this in a very disadvantaged position unless the US and the Europeans give something really, really credible to Ukraine. I think if you're in the prediction game, you still can't predict how this will end from where we're sitting right now.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak to all three of you to help us understand this incredibly complex moment in what will hopefully be the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine, but anybody's guess right now as to what the future will hold. Alexander Bratersky, Samir Puri, Donald Jensen, a pleasure having you on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here in Doha,